Good afternoon. Let's begin here. The ANC's National Executive Committee has agreed to establish an NEC task team to guide the party's response to the Zondo Commission's report. The party says this would be the development of its discussion paper for ANC structures on corruption and state capture. The remarks were made by ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa at the end of the party's two-day Lekgotla, which looked at economic renewal, among other issues. Let's look at this then and more with political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, good afternoon to you and thank you so much for your time. Another task team, this time it's to guide the party's response to the Zondo Commission's report. It sounds like the long way around. Was it a wise move?
Good afternoon to you and to the viewers. Yeah, it does seem like a kind of a much more expanded way of dealing with the whole question of the recommendations from the Zondo Commission. I mean, I think for me personally, do you need another task team? You've got to wait for the 3 volumes to be, the other 2 volumes to be published and then of course to be presented to the state president and so forth. But again, does this mean that a task team will now give you better clarity on how to deal with the issue of deployees and party members that have erred and have basically behaved recklessly or have been complicit and implicated in state capture? Does this mean that you're going to now have an internal process to deal with sanctioning of those members? How does this align with the state process, which is recommendations made by the acting Chief Justice Zondo in terms of what action needs to be taken? I think for me, it's just another layer of procrastination. And it's also kind of trying to say, well, the party will deal with this in the manner that it deals with all of its internal dynamics. But how do you separate this? Because this comes back to the question of what is the relationship between party and state? And if there has to be the prosecution or the kinds of actions and punitive measures that need to be taken at the state level, well, how does this differ in terms of what the party needs to do? Will the party delay this? Is this another deflection, another delay? And I think we've been here before in terms of how we've seen other resolutions and other task teams and the kinds of decisions that were made and where that has actually landed us now in terms of action, but also in terms of expediting process. And I think this is going to cause more challenges to the expediting of process.
And especially as you talk about the issue of the blurring of lines, I wonder then, given the fact that, shortly after the report was released, we saw varying, responses from some of the senior leaders themselves. Others are saying that they support the work of the commission, while others are saying that this report must not be used to fight factional battles. I wonder then, if there's a blurring of lines, as you say, and also a little bit of confusion when it comes to the state process that also needs to then proceed, can we expect tough action internally?
I think that's the big question. The question is, what will the task team do? We know that it's going to be essentially looking at process. It's going to be essentially looking at how to deal with the notion, or not with the notion, but deal with state capture there, and of course oversee how this is going to happen internally in the party. But of course it becomes another layer of bureaucratic inertia, in my opinion, between state and party, because the party may actually decide that, it doesn't want to take certain action against its members that have been implicated in state capture or have been part of state capture and now have to face the wrath of the law. This then means that you've got to go back to NEC subcommittees. There's got to be decisions and discussions around process, around procedure, around legislative issues, etc. So where the NPA and where, for example, the state can start to move on its case, it may be delayed. By the way, you may find that the task team hasn't necessarily aligned with the state process. And that, again, comes back to the question of resources, whether the resources that are already quite scarce will continuously be compromised in this whole process. But at the same time, I think it's not just about not knowing how to align the two processes. I think people who have been implicated in terms of people that have criminal charges that basically they're facing, we've seen how the step-aside rule has been applied. We see how people have reacted to the step-aside rule. And I just feel that we're entering another level of bureaucratic inertia and bureaucratic delays.
One of the things that we keep, hearing about is this toxic relationship and the factional battles and the poor structures and how things are difficult when it comes to, relations within the ANC. And when you look at what the president even said, is that, they recognize that the movement is going through a process of decay and degeneration, but it was able to revive itself in the past from similar situations. I wonder if this time it can rely on that previous experience to be able to overcome the challenges it currently faces?
I'm not so optimistic that it can do that. I think even in the past, where there's been claim that it has been able to pull back from the tipping point, or it has been able to revive itself, it's done so in a very, very narrow prism. And I think this time around, it's trying to revive itself in a model that's essentially broken, in a context that's essentially irreconcilable with some of the questions that it's raising. And so it's quite, in my opinion, it's quite important to ask the question is, how is this going to be different? How are you going to talk about things in terms of challenging the kinds of narratives, but also challenging behavior in the party, people whose behavior has not been in line with what the party claims as its values and principles. And so in that context, I think, again, we must remember it's a policy conference here as well. So again, this task team will be also aligning to what are some of the key policy recommendations that will come out as resolutions for the party at its elective conference later in the year. But again, the challenge here is whether or not we're going to see the kind of efficacy, but also the implementation of what is going to be implemented in all of this.
I'm borrowing from the statement. It says that the ANC and the Alliance reaffirm our support for the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the judiciary, and distance ourselves from narratives to seek to negate its transformative intent as well as gains. Are we wrong to read between the lines here as a response or a stance of the party to that, opinion letter by Tourism Minister Lindiwe Sisulu? And does it go far enough to address what we then saw unfold in the public domain in the past couple of days?
Well, I think it'll be hard not to draw those parallels in terms of the statement that you read out and what the statement seems to be indicating. The respect for the rule of law, the respect for the Constitution as the highest law of the land governing our democracy, respect for our democracy, and not basically taking these hard-earned democracy in a fickle way. So it's very hard not to say, well, we keep hearing the mantra, but of course it becomes much more relevant in terms of what we've seen in the context of the piece that the minister wrote. And the challenge here again is how is this being played out in the court of public opinion in terms of the dynamics in the party, and of course in terms of the alliance partners. It seems to me that there's a sense of not trying to become too kind of prescriptive in what the action should be, but going back to a very broad assessment to say that we're not going to essentially challenge the minister or challenge whoever the minister and the group that she represents has put out. And we're going to constantly see that kind of tiptoeing, if that's a better way to describe it, around this issue, which is quite a serious issue. So the question then becomes is, if we're seeing this tiptoeing and this kind of walking on eggshells around this, then what is the value addition of the statement?
All right, Sanusha, it looks like we are in for quite the political year, I tell you. And I don't think this is the last we have this conversation. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That was political analyst Sanusha Naidu.